Wow. Welcome to Find Happiness podcast where we find joy and peace. Yeah, today we have a Native American called Terri Kozlowski. She's a certified coach, a blogger, the author of Transcending Fears, and founder of Soul Solutions. She specializes in empowering women by teaching them to set personal boundaries, reframe the stories they tell themselves, overcome their fears, and push past their limits beliefs. Part memoir, part self-help guide. Terry's book is a raw and personal story of divine deep into childhood trauma, dealing with the terror before ultimately getting comfortable with fear and transcending it. On her successful podcast and YouTube channel, Soul Solution, she delves into the soul and offers bite-sized takeaways for controlling our egos and emotions. Terry holds a Bachelor in Science in Social Science, has written for Newsbreak, Tillfield, and Medium, appeared on over 80 podcasts, and has spoken to groups from 5 to 600. She has helped people with her hard-earned wisdom. Terry lives in Woodstock, Georgia, Atlanta, with her husband and a pampered chihuahua. Welcome, Terry. It's good to have you here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and have the opportunity to speak to your audience today.
Wow, nice. So, how are you doing today?
I'm doing fabulous. It's early morning here in the United States, and so I'm starting my day off with your audience.
Nice, nice, nice. And then I like your hat. Looks great.
Thank you.
Okay, so today I put a couple of questions to ask you, and I'm going to shoot right away. So,
Okay.
are you ready for this?
Ready.
Okay, so can you share with us the personal story of your childhood trauma and what specific events led to feelings of depression and anxiety in your life?
So my childhood trauma occurred when I was 11 years old. My parents divorced when I was 8, and my dad got custody of my sister and I, which was basically unheard of in the early 70s when this occurred. And I hadn't seen my mother because she was an alcoholic and a drug addict. So my mother finally asked my dad if we could come visit her. And at that point, she was living in New Mexico and we were living in Pennsylvania in the United States.
Wow.
And that's about 3,000 miles away from one another. And my dad agreed because my mother said she had been in Alcoholics Anonymous and she had quit her drinking. So we go out for what was supposed to be an 8-week summer visit. And we ended up leaving in about 4 weeks. The first week was fabulous, and some of the best memories I have of my mother occurred in that first week. And then she started drinking again. And for children of alcoholics, when you have a parent that drinks, there's a lot of codependency that comes out. And I became the parent, and my mother became the child. And these role reversals are difficult to deal with because as an 11-year-old, I'm not supposed to be taking care of the adult. I'm not supposed to be, when she vomits, cleaning up her vomit and putting my baby sister to bed at the same time. That's not my role. I'm the child. So we're going through these motions where, I am, taking care of things. I was going to the grocery store. I was fixing meals. I was paying bills. I'm 11 years old and I'm paying the rent for my mother.
Wow.
And all of this is happening in a very short time period. And one night we went to sleep. She was having a party. Everybody had passed out, and I had gone around and covered everybody up with blankets and went to bed. And I was locking our bedroom door at that point in time when the house was the apartment was full of other people. And I woke up with a gag in my mouth and my hands tied, and my mother standing in the room with her best friend watching as she allowed 3 men to rape me so she could have drugs for free. And after that event, they all disappeared. My mother left my sister and I alone on the streets of Albuquerque, New Mexico in the 1980 for 3 days by ourselves. And my sister slept during this period because they had drugged her so that she would sleep. And I have my little head on her chest, making sure she's breathing okay. And she finally wakes up and is crying for my mother. And I don't know where my mother is. And so I get my sister to eat, and my mother comes home that evening. And like nothing happened, like everything was fine. She sends us to the grocery store. And when we come back, she's on the stoop with our suitcases, and put the suitcases on the stoop and said that it was time for us to go home, and went back into the efficiency apartment, locked the door, and left my sister and I on the street. And I had to figure out how to get back to Pennsylvania, 3,000 miles away, to my dad. And I wanted to go to the police. And my sister was upset because she didn't want to get my mother in trouble. Again, this is where that codependency behavior comes through in children of alcoholics, where we don't want our beloved parent to get in trouble for their actions. And I had to call my dad because we had to get home, but I don't remember telling him Mom kicked us out. I remember being very clear that it was time to come home and we needed to come home really fast. And the next morning we were on an airplane and got home. And as we're getting off the airplane, my sister runs into my dad's arms, and I'm carrying the suitcases, and I set the suitcases down in front of my dad and said, I need therapy. At 11 years old, I was extremely aware. For a child, I knew what had happened to me was traumatic. I knew what had happened to me wasn't my fault. And I knew enough that I didn't know how to deal with it. So that was on a Saturday when we landed. Monday morning, I was in therapy. Now, this was back in 1980. They didn't quite know what to do with me because in the early 80s, they did not talk about child sexual abuse. So there wasn't the programs they have now, because back then they were saying 1 in 10 girls were sexually assaulted by the time they were 18. Now the number is 1 in 3 children before they are 18 are sexually assaulted. So the numbers have increased, but I don't necessarily think that actually has increased. I think that the reporting has increased, and that people are not as afraid as they used to be to report it. So I get back to Pennsylvania, I go into therapy and find out how to play what I call the game. Because since they didn't know what to do with me, I was trying to make sure that the one thing I did do correctly was make sure my dad knew I was okay. So I put on a mask and I put on some armor and said everything was okay. And that's what started the depression. Because when you deny what you're truly feeling, you're stuffing it, you're hiding it, you're pushing it down, and it gets stuck there. And as long as you are looking backwards at the trauma, looking to the past, it causes depression. So I went through a period of time where I was greatly depressed. I would have said that I had thoughts of not being around anymore. I don't think I actually thought about ways to kill myself, but I thought it would be better for everybody if I wasn't there. So all of those sad, negative things. I'm 11, 12, 13. So as I start into puberty, all of those extra hormones and emotions that you normally deal with if you were a healthy teenager, but when you have trauma underlying that, your personal growth gets stunted. Your emotional growth gets stunted. And I was stunted at 11 for a very, very long time. And part of that is because at 11, our egoic mind comes to our rescue. And it says, okay, this is what happened. We're going to do everything we can so this doesn't happen again. And it instills fear into us about trusting other people. And if other people know what happened to me, they're not going to like me. And on top of all that, you also have the people that harmed me, my mother and her best friend, telling me, shh, don't tell anybody. It's a secret. And the moment somebody else puts upon you that there's shame in telling your truth, that is something that's put upon you, it shuts us down. There's another part of it that gets shut down, which is our truth. Our truth gets stuffed, and we can't express that. And I believe this is all what caused my depression for about 5 years. When I got to college, I was very vocal about I had trauma. I didn't tell everybody what my trauma was, but I would let people know that I had trauma, because if you came up behind me and tapped me on the shoulder, I would come around with the fist because you weren't going to touch me. So I didn't want to hurt anybody. So I would let people know, don't do certain things. Don't tap me on the shoulder. Just holler my name and I'll turn around and, acknowledge you. So I went through this where I was vocal about something bad had happened to me, and I react negatively to certain stimuli. So because I was so vocal about it in college, I had a friend of mine tell me that I got something out of being the victim. Now, that comment made me very angry for a while, because who was he to tell me anything about my victimhood? But it made me pause and think about it. And what was I getting out of being vocal and telling other people that I had trauma? Well, I was getting something out of it. I was getting out of the fact that when I told somebody that I had trauma, and in the 80s, I graduated high school in 1986, and started college that year. So if you're talking about in the 80s, you're talking about people didn't talk about this. This was a taboo subject. So the moment I said I was traumatized, they didn't know what to say to me. So people left me alone. And that was what I got out of it. I wanted to be left alone. I didn't want a bunch of people around me asking questions that I didn't know how to answer, because I still had not processed everything that I had gone through. As I aged, one of the things that did happen was I didn't remember when I was 11, 12, 13, or 14 that my mother was standing in the room watching. Okay. That was something my 11-year-old mind closed off to protect me. Because if your mother can't love you and take care of you, who on the planet can? So at about 15, 16, I remembered that fact. And it really, really altered how I perceived the idea that other people could actually love me. Because at that point, I believe wholeheartedly I was unlovable. And instead of internalizing that, I did the exact opposite. So I went from being depressed, and then I had this friend say that I got something out of being a victim, which was I got my solitude, which is what I wanted. But at 18, I realized there has to be a better way for me to be in the world than to isolate myself from everybody. So I decided that instead of being a victim, I was going to be a survivor.
Yeah.
And what a survivor does is different than what a victim does. A victim looks backwards. A victim stays in depression. A victim says, why me? And we struggle with the why me question. I struggled for decades with the why me question. And we look for closure in something that you really can't get closure from. So when I became a survivor, I took responsibility for my actions from that day forward. Because if I now am responsible for how I respond to the world, that's me. That's not my mom. That's not the 3 men that raped me. It's not them who are maintaining control. But if I stay looking backwards and I stay a victim, they will always have a say in how I move forward in my life. So I took that out. Becoming a survivor meant I was now in charge. Now, that meant I was in charge for the good things and the bad things, and I couldn't blame anymore. I couldn't say, well, I punched you when you tapped me on the shoulder because I was raped when I was 11. I couldn't do that because I'm aware that that is a reaction I have, so I have to figure out a way to control that and take responsibility for my actions. Yes, it still may be traumatized in me, but in moving forward, for me to heal, I have to be responsible. So if I turn around and hit you, I have to apologize for the fact that I overreacted. And it wasn't your fault for tapping me on the shoulder. It was my fault for not taking a deep breath and figuring out, why did I just get tapped on the shoulder? Because nobody, and I'm an adult now. Okay. So, 18, 19, 20, you're an adult. I'm in college, and I have to be responsible for my actions. I'm not that 11-year-old who couldn't escape. I'm not that 11-year-old who wasn't big enough to scream or cry or do anything to try to get away. I am now an adult, and if I get fearful, I can leave the situation. And those are things my 11-year-old self couldn't do. So I do things in extremes. So I went from being depressed to 180 to becoming extremely anxious about everything, and was going into full-blown panic attacks while I was in college, because now I became, instead of focusing on my past, I focused on my future. And then I got scared about my future. And that's what anxiety is. Anxiety is fear of the future. And what if this happens? And what if that happens? And if I do this and this doesn't happen, how am I going to get by? All these things about focusing on the future, which you would think that if you're depressed, focusing on the future would be the right thing to do. But I went from being on medication for depression to being on medication for anxiety. And it took me another 2 or 3 years to finally realize that, wait a second. If I live in the past, I'm depressed. If I live in the future, I'm anxious. Maybe I should just live in the present moment. Because in the present moment, you and I are having a pleasant conversation. All is right with the world. There's no fear. I'm not concerned that you're going to say or do anything that's going to upset me. And we both have the same goal of helping your audience deal with depression and anxiety and find peace and happiness. And so everything is good. Everything is golden in the present moment. I don't know what's going to happen, in an hour. Neither do you. We're both going to be editing things, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But what it comes down to is living in the present moment. Yeah. Everything is good. Yeah. And we tend to focus our energies. And the ego never wants us to be present. Do you know why the ego doesn't want us to be present? When we are fully present, we are fully our authentic selves, and the ego doesn't exist. The ego only exists in looking backwards or looking forwards. In the present moment, the ego has no power. And if you think about all the negative thoughts you have about the future or about the past, that's all ego driven. And the ego has a really important job. The ego's job is to protect you. But the problem with the ego is it has a memory that you won't believe. It will always remember the 3 men, they were Hispanic men that raped me when I was 11. So for decades, I had great fear of Hispanic men, which is absolutely understandable for my particular case. But I started working with Hispanic men when I got into the career field. And in doing that, I realized that they're lovely human beings. And I was scared of an entire race of population because of 3 men. And that didn't seem to be correct, because logically, why do you dismiss a whole race of people because of 3 bad eggs? And so I had to figure out, okay, even if I get scared because of a group of Hispanic men, I have to remind myself I've had more positive experiences than negative experience with Hispanic men. I'll be just fine. And I can do something different now because I couldn't escape when I was 11. So as we move through these different stages and understand where our depression comes from and figure out ways to get past that, and understand that we are responsible for our healing journey. Yes, our trauma was horrible. Yes, we suffered greatly. However, we are responsible in how we move forward. We either can choose to sit in our misery and wallow and stay depressed, or we have to make the conscious decision that we are going to start our healing journey and become a survivor. And that's what I did.
Hmm. Where do I start from? Honestly, your story is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. I am
Thank
deeply
you.
moved by your courage to share it with us. I can't say less, I can't say more. I'll just move to the next question.
Move to the next question.
Okay, so let me read this out. So, how did your personal experience with childhood trauma and dealing with depression and anxiety shape your understanding and approach to mental health in your work as a life coach?
So, one of the things that happens when I have a new client and I get to know what their particular issue is, I'm very relatable in that most people think that my story of trauma is like really, really bad because it involves my mother. But for a lot of people who've had childhood trauma, especially childhood sexual trauma, mine was a one-time thing, one-time event. And a lot of sexual trauma is continuous over a long period of time. And so there's some additional mental health issues that arise in that because you then start feeling guilty for, as you get older, for your participation in it, for you allowing it. Or the other aspect is not telling another adult
Yeah.
to try to get you out of it, that the other adult won't believe you. Especially if it's a family member or a family friend that is really close with the parents, that becomes an issue. But because of my trauma, I related in the understanding that I'm not here for any other reason than to give you a different perspective.
Okay.
So whatever your trauma is, and we talk about it, my goal is to say, have you thought of this? Have you looked at it from this perspective? If you're still really suffering in a depression, why are you focused backwards? Why do you keep focusing on what happened in the past? Why do you keep focusing on the why question? And it took me until I was in my 40s before I found out what the real question, the right question to ask is. And I briefly talked about we look for closure. So we've had trauma, we've had issues, and now we're trying to we're on our healing journey and we try to have closure. And closure for me was wanting my mother to tell me why it happened. Why did she allow this to happen? And I understand she was a drug addict. I understand she was an alcoholic. I understand that in her mind, that was more important than anything else, was getting her high. But what it came down to was she passed away in 2013, and I never got closure. And interestingly enough, when my sister called and told me she had died, I wasn't upset that my mother died because I had not had a relationship with her. We spoke on and off, and prior to her death, I hadn't spoken to her in over 6 years. So we didn't have a relationship. And I wasn't ever close to her once the trauma occurred. So I was upset that I couldn't get closure now because I had patiently waited and hoped for closure and reconciliation of some sort.
Yeah.
Because that's what our soul and our spirit want, is to be reconciled with those people that have harmed us, especially family members. We want to have reconciliation. So I didn't get closure, and now I'm trying to figure out, now what do I do? I didn't get closure. I'm never going to find out why it happened. But the reality is, even if I would have had the opportunity to ask her, why did you let this happen? There's not a single answer that she could have given me that would have justified the behavior of her not protecting me. So what I realized was I was asking the wrong question. It shouldn't be why me. The question we should be asking is, now what? Now what do I do because this trauma occurred? Now what do I do to take control back? Now what do I do to empower myself to move forward? Now what do I do to be fully present and deal with the fact that I stuff emotions. And when I stuff emotions, somehow those emotions are going to come out. Whether you are stuffing them and they come out in explosions of anger, whether you're stuffing and they come out because you're reading a book and there's tears streaming down your face because that is your release, or if you are stuffing emotions and you are so good at stuffing emotions that it physically affects you, which is what I did. It physically affected. I kept stuffing my emotions down into my stomach, and finally my appendix ruptured. Boom. And part of that was because I was not dealing with myself. I was dealing with everything else. I was married. I had kids, doing all that good stuff that we're supposed to do. But I wasn't dealing with my healing journey.
Yes.
And I stuffed enough, and I kept stuffing. And my body finally said, we can't take the stuffing anymore. And my appendix ruptured. And then I ended up with peritonitis afterwards. I almost died. So I spent about 8 weeks in and out of the hospital and going through recovery. And during those 8 weeks is when I realized that I can't do this anymore. My body is not going to be able for me to continue to not deal with the trauma that I had been stuffing for decades.
So how old were you by this time when you realized this? Sorry for cutting you.
This was in 2001. So I had been, I was.
That's fine.
I was in my early 30s at that point.
Okay.
I was in my early 30s.
Okay.
And again, one of the things that happens is, let's pretend you lived a happy-go-lucky childhood and you had all your needs and you had loving family, you had no trauma. And as you go, we talk about software versions. Everybody knows that, you have 1.0 and 2.0 and 3.0, and that each time it gets improved, bugs get worked out. We're supposed to do the same thing. Our brains are our software. And you come into this world with knowing who you authentically are, knowing you have a purpose, and knowing that you are to love and be loved. And yet that first family you come into, if it's a good one, then you continue to grow. If it's a bad one, or you have trauma because of somebody in your family, that software, you don't get the updates. Yeah. And you're stuck at software 1.0. And I was stuck at software 1.0 for almost 30 years before I finally realized I needed to do a software upgrade and go to 2.0. And I think every 10 years, we all need to have a software upgrade and go, if you're 40, you should have software 4.0. I'm in my 50s, so I have 5.0 version now. I finally am where I'm supposed to be with my software version. But we have to know that as we move through life, as we go on our healing journey, we need to be able to change our mindset. We need to be able to unlearn those things that we were taught that were wrong. We are to make sure that our software gets upgraded so that the experiences we've had are part of the core software and how we move forward. And that is where I am in my journey, and what I'm trying to get my clients to see is that if you had trauma when you were a child, are you still operating on that 1.0 software, even though you're 50 years old? You should be on 5.0 now. So let's go ahead and figure out how to jump you through those versions, because you can't skip a version. You can't go from 1.0 to 5.0. You have to go to 2.0 and 3.0 and 4.0, because those are different mindsets on how you handle and deal with things. We talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and the first level is making sure that you have all the things needed to survive. So you have food and water and clothing and a roof over your head. Mm-hmm. And once you have that, the second level is safety. And that's where I got stuck. I didn't feel safe. When you can't be safe with your mother, how can you be safe with anybody else? So until I got my safety, which is with my current husband, I've been with him for 25 years. He was the first person that I was with that in his presence, I wasn't afraid. I had always, from the time I was 11, fear just was in me. Everybody was out to get me. Everybody was going to hurt me. I needed to protect myself. But for some reason, when I was with him, I didn't feel afraid. And I actually felt that I would be protected. So when I married him and I had that fear base taken care of, I wasn't fearful in just being with others. The amount of growth I did was exponential. Because you can't have any personal growth until you feel safe. So my growth was exponential in the past 25 years to quickly get to the current version of software I'm operating on,
5.0.
5.0.
Oh, so you'll be heading for 6.0, 7.0, and going up so. Wow,
Correct.
wow. Your personal experience um has really shaped you. Has really shaped you. Like
Thank you.
it has made you the kind of coach that you are, because listening to you, I'm just standing still, not saying anything. I'm wowed. There's so much wealth of knowledge in what you say, and sharing your experiences. It's something for the world to hear, honestly. Honestly.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll move to the next question. Can you speak to the importance of addressing and understanding fear in the process of overcoming limiting beliefs?
So fear, like I said, the ego's job is to make sure that we're safe.
Yeah.
However, the ego will lie. It will steal. It will tell us untruths to keep us safe. So for me, one of the things that my ego told me was that all Hispanic men were to be afraid. I was supposed to stay away from Hispanic men. And there's a basis to it. There's truth to it. But over time, I had more positive experiences than negative experiences with Hispanic men. So should I go by my experience or my 11-year-old ego? And part of, again, that's that software version upgrade. But also, when we have limiting beliefs, that means that every Hispanic man that I came in contact with, I was dismissing because of fear. I was dismissing and didn't think that maybe they could contribute anything into my life. Or in a work environment, I would dismiss them because I didn't want to have a meeting with them. So I was limiting my own growth and development because I was limiting who I was connecting with. And when we look at fears and phobias, and we look at racism, we look at sexism, we look at any of the isms, all of that is based on fear. And a lot of times, the only way to overcome that fear is to make a connection, an authentic connection with somebody that for some reason we believe we should be fearful of. So, one of the things that I've talked about with others is that when we look back at history and the current, we've had a racial revolutions and we're having a sexual revolution, but there have always been people of color. There have always been, I truly believe that the lesbian and gay people have always been a part of society. They just weren't, they were kept secret. they were in the closet. They weren't out of the closet, but they've always been around, just like there's always been shamanism, and there's always been different forms of natural religion, different forms of natural healing that have always been around, that because of the age of technology, we see more of it. And so in that way, in that respect, it's good. There's more exposure, but at the same time, it's like all of a sudden people are saying there's more homosexuals in the world than there used to be. And no, they're just safe for them to be out in the open. And the reason I bring it up that way is because it's changing our perspective.
Yeah.
And when we change our perspective and saying, whatever you do is okay for you to do, as long as you don't impose your will upon my will, we're fine. And that's all any of us want. We all want to feel that who we authentically are is okay. And when we have limiting beliefs, whether it's about ourselves or about others, those limiting beliefs say something is wrong. And the ego perpetuates fear by saying, yes, those people are wrong, or you are wrong for believing that. And the reality is none of us are identical. Identical twins still have different personalities.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So no one is identical to somebody else. And you and I briefly talked at the opening of the show that I had done a DNA, and my husband had done a DNA, and my last name is Polish in origin, and my husband's not at all Polish. So when we look at our DNA and think that, oh, I'm Native American, well, yes, I'm Native American. I'm mostly Native American, but my dad was Italian and Irish. So I'm Italian and Irish too. Most of the people on the planet nowadays are not anything in a pure race because of all the intermingling that has been done over the years, over the centuries. And we need to understand and accept that who you authentically are and who I authentically am, all we want is to be. That's it. We just want to be. And we want to be loved, and we want to be cared for. We want to love, and we want to care for others. And we all want the same thing. And therefore, any limiting beliefs we have about us or others is harming us and others. And those limiting beliefs keep us trapped in looking backward in a way, or looking forward in a way that's harmful to us. But being fully present is the only way you can connect authentically with others. Being fully present and making those authentic connections are truly what our brains were made to do. Their functionality is made to interconnect with others. And that is why community is so important. Whether it's across the globe because of the internet, or whether it is one-on-one, that community is so precious. And we learned that with COVID and the fact that we became so isolated.
Yeah.
And when we started reaching out on the internet and making sure that we were making that eye contact, because eye contact is how we know if the person's connecting with us, if they're listening, if they're being authentic, and they're taking in what we're saying. And those connections are so vital in this day and age. And I think that's why so many people are taking that healing journey, because we're open to everybody being who they authentically are. We're open to the idea that no one is broken. Everybody is whole. And the reason we may feel broken, because I did feel broken for a long time, but what I finally realized was I wasn't broken. It was just that I was putting on the masks and armors, and I was hiding, and my authenticity was trying to shine through. But because I was fragmented, what came through was fragmented because of the masks and armor. What I felt was brokenness really was the fact that my authenticity wasn't being able to shine as brightly as it could. When I took off the masks and armor, which can be very scary when you do it the first time, because you are being your authentic self with someone. But really interesting, if you ask somebody, hey, do you want me to wear my mask and armor while we have this conversation, or do you want me to be authentic? What are you going to tell me? You want me to be authentic. Nobody wants to be in the presence of somebody else and have a conversation if everybody's wearing masks and armor, because we're not really then making an authentic connection. Authentic connections can only happen when our masks and armors are laid down.
Wow. So fear can be a very powerful obstacle, honestly. But with the right guidance, it can be overcome. Your understanding of the role of fear, your understanding of the role fear plays in limiting beliefs is truly impressive, and I give it to you.
Thank you.
I give it to you. I'll go back to something I skipped earlier on before coming to this
Okay.
question. Yeah. So, how do you help individuals set personal boundaries and um, reframe the stories they tell themselves?
Okay, so setting up personal boundaries really is about telling others how you want to be treated.
Okay.
Okay. So for somebody like myself who I knew I was codependent and I had codependent behaviors. And when somebody was falling down, I would go and pick them up and clean up their messes and everything instead of allowing them to learn how to clean up their own messes. So I wasn't actually helping them learn how to deal with their lives. I was actually going in and rescuing them. And that's a bad thing to do. So, and for me to set up personal boundaries for others was being able to say, I'm sorry you're laying on the ground. You're not bleeding. Do you need help getting up? I have to put boundaries in place and allow others to say, hey, I need help, instead of allowing me to come in and rescue them. Another thing about personal boundaries is they're hard to set, especially with loved ones. And my mother, I had to learn to set them with her because she would call and we would have conversations, and I didn't have an issue with that except when she was drunk. Because when she was drunk, she was really, really mean and very, very mean to me. And so I put a personal boundary up in place that, Mom, if you're going to drink, I'm not going to talk to you when you're drunk. And I told her that when she was sober. And of course, people have to test you. And my mother called drunk. And I answered the phone and I said, Mom, you're drunk. I can't talk to you. And I hung up the phone. Then this is when they used to still be plugged into the wall. And I unplugged the phone from the wall, slid down the wall crying because I hung up the phone on my mother. And I had grown up with the whole idea that you respect your mother and your father and you don't do those types of things. But that was the personal boundary I needed to put in place. And, a couple weeks later, she called and she was sober and I talked to her. So learning to put those personal boundaries in place isn't necessarily about other people. It's about protecting yourself. That's how you show your ego that I am capable and growing and can handle this differently than the way you handle it when I was 11. So that's personal boundaries. As far as retelling the stories you tell yourself, that can be a little bit more difficult because you have told yourself the same story over and over and over and over again, and your ego has perpetuated that underlying fear in you. So for you to tell yourself a different story, so instead of saying, I am a victim of child sexual trauma, I say, I'm a survivor of child sexual trauma. Very, very different connotation. Very, very different energy that's translated. Because if I say I'm a victim, you feel sad. It invokes negativity. When I say I'm a survivor, it instills hope and positivity and somebody has overcome something. So just being able to understand that the way we talk to ourselves is so vital. And if we're being negative, if we're being judging, if we're blaming and shaming and feeling guilty and putting all that upon ourselves, then we end up feeling depressed because we're still looking backwards. But when you change a story you tell yourself, and instead of saying that I overreact when people tap me on the shoulder, I now say when people tap me on the shoulder, I know to pause and slowly turn around. Knowing that I'm pausing allows me to remember what moment I'm in. I'm in this moment, not when I'm 11. And that pause allows our brains and our souls to reconnect. Because the ego's going, oh my gosh, somebody just tapped you on the shoulder. Okay? It's immediate and it's loud. The ego's very loud. The soul and your heart they speak in whispers. So the only way you can hear them is to get really quiet. Get really quiet so you can listen to your soul. And when you get quiet and listen to your soul, or when you pause and take a deep breath and reconnect to your soul, when you turn around, instead of hitting somebody, you end up smiling because you aren't 11 and that person there is a friend. That is what I mean by retelling the stories you tell yourself, is that you have to change the narrative that you've been that's been playing in your head for as long as it has been, so that you can move forward in a way that you want to. You can't live your dreams if you are still dealing and living in the past. You can't fulfill your dreams if you're looking backwards. That's not the direction you're heading. You're heading forward. So to live in the present moment and deal with the decisions you make in the here and now is the only way you can make your dreams a reality.
Oh, okay. So, ego and emotions are very complex and intricate parts of the human experience, and you mentioned that in your you mentioned that a lot recently, like you're talking. So, I think that you'd need to discuss the role of ego and emotions in the journey towards self empowerment.
Self-empowerment is a choice. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
We don't consciously choose to be victims. Okay. We don't consciously choose to have trauma in our life. We have to consciously choose to become a survivor. We have to consciously choose to retake our power back from those people who took it from us. And in order to do that, it's a mindset shift. And to make that mindset shift, you have to be able to understand that for me to be a survivor and for me to live the life I was supposed to live, despite the trauma, I have to make sure that I empower myself to do so. And to empower yourself really means you consciously make a decision to not allow past events to continue to harm your present and your future.
Mm-hmm.
It's a mindset shift. And it's as simple as that, is that making that decision. The hard part is then living it out. And that's the emotional aspect of things, because when you are triggered and something from the past triggers you and you have fear rise up, the easiest technique I can share with all of you on how to calm yourself down is to take 3 deep breaths. So we're going to do it together. We're going to take a deep breath to a count of 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Hold for a count of 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And exhale for a count of 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If you do that 3 times, your autonomic nervous system goes into effect. It's an automatic response, physical response that your body has. You lower your blood pressure, you lower your breathing rate. So in that aspect of taking those 3 deep breaths like that, you physically alter how you feel and you actually calm down. And that technique, when you're being triggered, when something is causing you to react, when you're starting to feel negativity, doing that will bring you back to center. And that is very, very important for people who are depressed or anxious to get back to feeling calm and balanced and centered.
Wow. The ability to effectively help individuals deal with depression is a true talent, honestly. And
Thank you.
we need more of you in this world, because the
Thank
whole
you.
world is depressed. A lot of people are going through stuff and they can't speak up. They can't even say. They die in shame. They die in pain, and all of that. And now this awareness goes a long way to help people. Like I said
Thank
earlier
you.
on, that's why we have Find Happiness. We try as much as we can to get resource persons like you and the others that have been on this podcast to tell their die-hard stories. Like, come on, this is not easy to share. I mean, it takes a lot.
I've gotten to the place where sharing it makes me happy. It's my happy space.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. So, anyways, what advice will you give to individuals who are currently going through a similar situation of childhood trauma and dealing with depression and anxiety that you have experienced? Let's wrap up with that.
The the main thing I want people to know is that you are whole, you are worthy just as you are, and as long as you allow your authentic self to shine through, everything will be okay. Stay in the present moment, Because in the present moment, you can't be depressed and you can't be anxious. You have to stay in the present moment. And the present moment, everything is fine. In the present moment, you are safe. And in the present moment, you are whole and loving. And everybody loves you in the present moment. And that is why I think that techniques to remind people the breathing exercise to get them back into being fully present is such a powerful tool for them to understand that being fully present is when you're whole. Being your authentic self was all that you were ever meant to be. And just because you've had trauma, just because you've had anxiety, or just because you have depression, doesn't mean you are broken, doesn't mean you aren't whole. It doesn't mean that you are unworthy, because
Yeah.
just as you are, a baby comes into the world and it can't do anything. It can't feed itself. It can't talk. It can't do anything. And yet nobody on the planet will look at that baby and say it's unworthy to be cared for. Everybody knows that that baby is worthy to be cared for. And just because you've had trauma in your life doesn't mean you're not worthy. And understanding that you are worthy and that your healing journey is what you need to move through so that you can then help those around you.
Wow. Your journey is a source of inspiration for many, and your advice would no doubt be invaluable to those who are currently going through a similar situation. Your words of encouragement and practical advice would be greatly appreciated by those who are struggling with aftermath of childhood trauma and mental health issues. This is highly appreciated. Thanks, Terry.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
You're welcome.
Thanks a million times. Yeah,
You're
before we
welcome.
go, would you mind sharing your contact, social media contact, or contact in general, so people who are going through this, who want to reach you, and who want to reach out to you and talk to you about this and get some coaching from you?
Okay.
Yeah.
My website is terrikozlowski.com. If you look at the underneath my name, TerriKozlowski.com. My book is Raven.
Can you take it slowly, please?
Okay, terrikozlowski.com. TerriKozlowski.com.
Yeah.
The book is Raven Transcending Fear, and it is my personal story on how I overcame child sexual trauma and abuse and how I transcended the fear that I lived in for so long. And then my podcast is called the Soul Solutions Podcast, and it's on anywhere you are, you can find it. And it gives you each week something to apply to your life so that you can make small changes and live the life you dream of living. And it comes out every Tuesday.
Wow. And finally, thank you for sharing your personal story and expertise with us. It takes a lot of courage to open up about such a difficult experience, and I appreciate your willingness to share. I am grateful for the opportunity to hear from you and learn from your experience. And to our viewers, this has brought us to an end. Thanks for watching. Until next time, stay safe and speak up whenever you feel depressed, whenever you have pain, whenever you have things that you think you can't speak up, just still say them out. Thanks for watching, and till next time, bye.